3 years ago, my HOA threatened to take my house over a rain barrel. 9 months later, I stood in a courtroom and watched a judge order their entire water system shut down. The craziest part wasn't that they lost. The craziest part was that I gave them every chance to avoid it. My name is Ethan Mercer, and back then I lived in a small desert subdivision called Canyon Ridge Estates, about 40 minutes outside Tucson, Arizona. If you've never lived in southern Arizona, it's hard to explain what water means out there. People talk about water the way folks in other places talk about money. Every gallon matters. Every dry season feels personal. The neighborhood itself wasn't anything special. Rows of tan stucco houses, gravel front yards, identical mailboxes lined up like soldiers. The kind of place where people waved politely while secretly keeping track of what color you painted your front door. Honestly, I didn't buy the house because I love the community. I bought it because of the paperwork. That probably sounds weird, but I'm a groundwater consultant. I've spent most of my adult life studying aquifers, recharge systems, water tables, and all the invisible things beneath people's feet that keep civilization functioning. While reviewing the property records before closing, I noticed something most buyers would have skipped right over. A water rights clause, buried near the back. One paragraph, a few lines, but those few lines changed everything. At the time, I filed the information away in my head and moved on. I didn't think it would ever matter. Certainly not enough to start a neighborhood war. The first few months were quiet. I unpacked, fixed some plumbing, replaced old irrigation lines, met a few neighbors. One of them was a retired electrician named Frank Donnelly. Frank had the permanent sunburn of a man who'd spent 50 years outdoors and the kind of laugh that always sounded like he was getting away with something. "You new around here?" he asked one afternoon while watching me unload supplies from my truck. "That obvious? You bought the only house in the neighborhood that sat empty longer than 6 months." I laughed. "Should I be worried?" "Nah," he said. "Just stay off the HOA radar." Then he grinned. "Actually, forget that. Nobody stays off the HOA radar." At the time, I thought he was joking. Turns out he wasn't. You see, one thing that bothered me almost immediately was how dependent everyone was on the community well. One pump, one source, one failure point. As someone who worked around water systems, that kind of setup made my skin crawl. So I decided to build some backup infrastructure. Nothing crazy, just smart planning. I installed a rainwater harvesting system with roof collection channels, underground storage tanks, filtration units, and a separate irrigation loop completely disconnected from the community water supply. The whole system was legal, professionally designed, fully permitted through the county, and almost entirely invisible. Unless someone knew exactly where to look, they would never notice it existed. The first decent storm rolled through that spring. I remember standing on my back patio, watching rainwater disappear into the collection system. The tanks filling, the filters humming, everything working exactly as intended. It felt satisfying, not because I was proving anything, because I wasn't dependent anymore. 11 days later, I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter. The HOA, of course. The letter informed me that I was in violation of multiple community standards due to unauthorized water infrastructure modifications. I read it twice, then a third time. Halfway through, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. The next morning, I walked into the HOA office. The president was a woman named Linda Barrett. Mid-50s, perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect smile. The kind of smile people use when they're already convinced they're right. She looked up as I entered. "Mr. Mercer." "Linda." I placed a violation letter on her desk. "We need to talk." Her smile never moved. I assumed we would. I tapped the paper. "My water system is underground." "That's not the issue." "Then what is?" "It's an unapproved modification." I stared at her for a second. "You can't even see it. Visibility isn't the concern." That was the moment something clicked in my head. This wasn't about aesthetics. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't even about water. It was about authority. Some people get uncomfortable when they discover they can't control someone. And Linda Barrett looked very uncomfortable. "I'm not removing it," I said. Her smile tightened slightly. "Then enforcement procedures will begin." I nodded, picked up the letter, and headed for the door. Just before I left, she said something that stuck with me. "Nobody gets special treatment here, Mr. Mercer." I looked back. Good. I walked out. At the time, neither of us understood where that conversation was headed. But within a few months, a drought would hit the region. The neighborhood, well, would start failing. And the small backup system they wanted me to destroy would become the center of a fight that nobody saw coming. The first fine was $200. I paid it the same afternoon. Not because I agreed with it, because arguing over $200 felt like a waste of energy. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate after that. Every few weeks, another notice showed up. Another violation. Another penalty. Another reminder that somebody in the HOA office spent a surprising amount of time thinking about my backyard. Frank thought the whole thing was hilarious. One evening, he wandered over while I was checking one of the filtration units. "You know, Linda talks about your water tanks more than she talks about her husband." I laughed. "That's concerning for both of us." He shook his head. "I'm serious. Half the board meetings are basically about you now." That should have worried me. Instead, it mostly annoyed me. Because while the HOA was obsessing over paperwork, something much bigger was happening. The rain stopped. Not gradually. Just stopped. Weeks passed. Then months. The ground hardened. The air got hotter. The kind of Arizona heat that makes you feel like somebody opened an oven every time you step outside. People started noticing small things first. Brown patches in lawns. Dying shrubs. Dry landscaping. Then came the official notice. Water restrictions. Mandatory conservation measures. No lawn watering. No vehicle washing. Limited irrigation. Shorter showers. The neighborhood was nervous. And honestly, they had every reason to be. The community, well, had been dropping faster than expected. Much faster. Meanwhile, my property looked exactly the same. Not lush. Not extravagant. Just alive. A vegetable garden. A few citrus trees. Some landscaping that wasn't actively dying. Everything watered using collected rainwater stored months earlier. That's when the attention started. People slowed down while driving past. Neighbors stared. Conversations got quieter when I walked by. Nobody said much directly, at least not at first. Then one afternoon, Frank leaned over the fence. "People are talking." "About what?" He pointed to my garden. "You know exactly about what." I looked around. The rest of the neighborhood looked exhausted. Brown. Dry. Fading. Mine didn't. "They think you're cheating." I laughed. "Cheating what?" "The drought." That one actually got me. Because, in a weird way, that's exactly what preparation looks like to people who didn't prepare. A week later, the knock came. 3 sharp raps. Authoritative. I already knew who it was before opening the door. Linda Barrett stood there. This time she wasn't alone. A county compliance officer stood beside her. Not a police officer, but close enough to make an impression. "Mr. Mercer," Linda said, "we need to discuss your water usage." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "I had a feeling you might." Her eyes drifted toward my yard. "Multiple residents have reported ongoing irrigation activity." "That's true." Her expression brightened slightly, like she just scored a point. Then I continued. "On a completely independent water system." The smile disappeared. We walked around back. I showed them everything. The collection lines. The filtration system. The storage tanks. The irrigation loop. The monitoring system. Every component. The compliance officer spent nearly 20 minutes inspecting it. Eventually, he straightened up and looked at Linda. "It's legal." Her jaw tightened. "That doesn't make it fair." The officer glanced at her, then at me, then wisely chose not to get involved. I folded my arms. Fair. Everyone else is making sacrifices. There it was. The real issue. Not water. Not regulations. Not safety. Resentment. I remember looking directly at her and saying something that probably didn't help. Everyone had the same opportunity to prepare. The silence afterward felt heavy. Linda's face turned red. Not dramatically. Just enough. The kind of red that appears when someone knows they're losing an argument but hasn't accepted it yet. When they finally left, I figured the matter was settled. I was wrong. 2 weeks later, a new letter arrived. This one was different, far more aggressive. The HOA accused me of unauthorized water activity, potential interference with community resource management, possible violations requiring legal review. I read it twice, then set it on the kitchen table. Something had changed. The goal wasn't compliance anymore. The goal was pressure. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted me intimidated. They wanted me to surrender simply because fighting back required effort. Unfortunately for them, effort was something I had plenty of. That evening, I dug out my property records, the original survey maps, the title documents, everything. One particular page caught my attention. The same page I'd noticed years earlier when buying a house. The water rights clause. I read it again, slowly, then again. Something about the language bothered me. Not because it looked weak, because it looked stronger than I remembered. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Rachel Sloan. We'd worked together years before on a groundwater dispute involving agricultural land. Rachel wasn't the kind of lawyer who wasted words. She listened, asked questions, then requested copies of every document I had. 3 days later, my phone rang. I answered. The first thing she said was, "Please tell me nobody else has looked at these records." Why? There was a pause. Then she laughed. Not a happy laugh. The dangerous kind. The kind lawyers make when they discover something valuable. "Ethan, your HOA has a problem." I sat up straighter. What kind of problem? A very expensive one. Now she had my attention. Rachel spent nearly an hour explaining survey boundaries, subsurface easements, groundwater allocations, and historical property transfers dating back decades. Most of it would have bored anyone else. To me, it was fascinating. Then she got to the important part. The community well. The well everyone depended on. The well managed by the HOA. The well that had suddenly become the center of everyone's attention. According to the original surveys, portions of the aquifer feeding that well extended directly beneath a section of land covered by my water rights. I stared at the wall, trying to process what she was saying. "How certain are you?" "Certain enough that I'd file tomorrow." My stomach tightened, not from excitement, from realization, because suddenly this wasn't about fines anymore. It wasn't about rain barrels. It wasn't about Linda Barrett. It wasn't even about the HOA. This had become a property rights dispute worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. "What happens if you're right?" I asked. Rachel didn't hesitate. "We can seek an injunction." I knew exactly what that meant, but I wanted to hear her say it. The well, it stops pumping. The room went quiet. Outside my kitchen window, I could see rooftops stretching across the subdivision. Families, kids, retirees, people who had absolutely nothing to do with the fight. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt conflicted. Rachel must have heard it in my voice. "You're thinking about the neighbors." "Yeah, they're not the ones suing you." "No, the HOA is." I rubbed my forehead, still staring out the window, still thinking about what came next. Rachel finally broke the silence. "We can negotiate first." I thought about every letter, every fine, every threat, every opportunity Linda had to stop escalating. Then I remembered something she'd said months earlier. "Nobody gets special treatment here." I almost laughed, because if Rachel was right, nobody was about to get special treatment. Not even the HOA. And that's when I made the decision that changed everything. "File it," I said. What I didn't know then was that within a few weeks, a judge would make a ruling that would leave the entire neighborhood standing in their driveways staring at dry faucets and wondering how everything had gone so wrong. Once the lawsuit was filed, everything changed. Up until that point, most people in Canyon Ridge thought this was just another HOA argument. Maybe a stubborn homeowner. Maybe an overreaching board. The kind of neighborhood drama people gossip about while walking their dogs. But lawsuits have a way of making things real, especially when water is involved. The hearing happened 6 weeks later. I remember walking into the courthouse that morning feeling strangely calm. Not confident, not nervous, just tired. Tired of the letters, tired of the threats, tired of watching a simple disagreement grow into something nobody seemed capable of stopping. Rachel was already there organizing documents. Across the room sat Linda Barrett and 2 attorneys hired by the HOA. For the first time since I'd met her, Linda didn't look completely sure of herself. There were dark circles under her eyes. Stacks of paperwork covered the table. And every few minutes, she'd flip through the same documents as if somehow the words might change. They didn't. The hearing itself wasn't dramatic, at least not at first. No shouting. No surprise witnesses. No television courtroom theatrics. Just facts. Maps. Surveys. Property records. Historical water rights documentation dating back decades. Rachel walked the judge through everything piece by piece. Every boundary. Every transfer. Every legal description. Every survey marker. By the time she finished, even I was impressed. The HOA's attorneys tried fighting back. They argued historical usage, community necessity, shared infrastructure, good faith operation. Some of their arguments weren't unreasonable. The problem was that reasonable arguments don't override property rights. Eventually, the judge leaned back in his chair and reviewed the final documents. The entire courtroom seemed to shrink. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he looked up, and everything changed. The plaintiff has demonstrated a substantial likelihood that the community well is currently extracting groundwater from a protected subsurface area subject to existing ownership rights. The room went completely silent. The judge continued. Pending final resolution, the court grants the requested injunction. Another pause, then a sentence that detonated like a bomb. Extraction operations are to cease immediately. That's it. No dramatic music. No Vavel Islam. Just one sentence. A simple sentence that shut down the only water source serving the entire neighborhood. 24 hours later, the pump stopped. The effects showed up almost immediately. Pressure dropped, then dropped again, then vanished. People stepped outside confused. Garden hoses stopped working. Kitchen faucets sputtered. Neighbors gathered in driveways, trying to understand what was happening. The water trucks arrived 2 days later. Huge tanker trucks rolling through the subdivision like emergency vehicles after a natural disaster. Temporary storage tanks appeared near common areas. Residents lined up with containers, coolers, buckets, anything that could hold water. It felt surreal. Frank showed up at my house that evening. He didn't look angry, which somehow made it worse. He just looked disappointed. Ethan, I nodded. Frank. He stared out toward the street where another tanker truck was pulling into the neighborhood. You really did it. I sighed. The court did it. He shook his head. Maybe. Then he looked directly at me. But you started it. That one landed harder than I expected. Not because he was wrong. Because he wasn't entirely right either. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. And the middle is usually where the uncomfortable answers live. For the next week, the HOA scrambled. Emergency meetings. Emergency contractors. Emergency expenses. Money started disappearing fast. Thousands of dollars every day just to maintain temporary water access. The pressure was becoming unbearable. Then one evening there was another knock at my door. I already knew who it was. Linda Barrett. Alone. No attorneys. No officials. No authority. Just Linda. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The woman standing on my porch barely resembled the person who'd threatened me months earlier. Exhaustion does strange things to people. So does losing. Can we talk? She asked quietly. I stepped aside. We sat at my kitchen table. The same table where I'd opened the violation letters. The same table where I'd made the call to Rachel. Funny how life works sometimes. Neither of us touched the coffee sitting between us. Finally, Linda broke the silence. We didn't know. I believed her. Honestly, I did. I don't think the HOA ever intentionally violated anyone's rights. I think they got comfortable. Comfortable people stop asking questions. And eventually assumptions become policies. Policies become rules. Rules become problems. I know, I said. She looked up. But you still kept pushing. Her eyes dropped to the table. Because there wasn't really an argument against that. After a long silence, she finally said what she'd come to say. We need a solution. There it was. Not a demand. Not a threat. A request. Maybe the first genuine request she'd made since I'd moved into the neighborhood. I thought about it for a moment. Then I laid out my terms. Every fine removed permanently. Formal recognition that my water collection system existed outside HOA authority. Compensation for prior groundwater extraction. An illegally binding access agreement moving forward. Linda listened quietly. When I finished, she asked one question. How much compensation? I named a number. $15,000. The room fell silent. She closed her eyes briefly. Not because the amount was impossible. because she knew it was cheaper than the alternative. 3 days later, the agreement was signed. The injunction was lifted. The pumps restarted. Water returned. And just like that, the crisis ended. At least officially. The long-term consequences were a different story. The HOA eventually funded construction of an entirely new well outside the disputed boundary area. The project cost a little over $200,000. Every homeowner received a special assessment. Every homeowner except me. Linda resigned 6 weeks later. By the end of the summer, she had moved away. I never saw her again. Frank still lived next door. One afternoon, months later, he leaned over the fence and smirked. You know, this whole thing would have been a lot cheaper if they'd just left you alone. I laughed. You're probably right. Probably. Okay, definitely. The funny part is what happened afterward. Once people understood how my water system worked, neighbors started asking questions, then asking for advice, then asking for help. Eventually, during particularly dry months, I started sharing excess stored water with a few residents who needed it. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic, just practical. Funny how the same people who once thought I was the problem eventually started seeing me as part of the solution. And maybe that's the lesson buried underneath all of this. Most conflicts aren't really about rules. They're about control, about pride, about people becoming so attached to being right that they stop paying attention to reality. I never wanted to shut down a neighborhood's water supply. I never wanted a courtroom battle. I never wanted any of it. I just wanted to protect something that belonged to me. The question is whether I went too far once other families got caught in the middle. Some people still think I did. Others think the HOA got exactly what it deserved. Honestly, even now I'm not completely sure where I land. And that's why I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have filed the lawsuit? Would you have backed down for the sake of the community? Or would you have done exactly what I did and forced the people in power to face the consequences of their own decisions? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on it.